As many of you know, because many of you were there, I taught a retreat a couple weeks ago or a week ago, and we did a fair amount of contemplation. And I thought it might be useful to speak a little bit more about the value of contemplation. And furthermore, it seemed to be required because I tried putting together two different other talks, and neither of them wanted to be put together, and instead contemplation wanted to be the theme. So that's where we are tonight. We're going to talk about contemplation and contemplation as a way of using our minds. You know, often we use our minds mainly for thinking, which may or may not be all that helpful. And so contemplation is a way that the Buddha teaches, really, about using our minds in a way that is wholesome. And if you were at the retreat, you heard me say probably about 16 times a quote from Ajahn Sucitto, who said that the path, our path, is always one of bringing skillful conditions to bear, so that no matter what's going on, the path is one of bringing skillful conditions to that. And indeed, not only bringing skillful conditions, but letting them have their effect by letting them expand these skillful conditions, letting ourselves dwell in skillful conditions, letting them nourish us. So our path, he says, is always one of bringing skillful conditions to bear. And it can be kind of an interesting inquiry. Sometimes when we meditate, you know, we can, you know, again, some of you at the retreat will hear me say some things over again, but Ajahn Sucitto speaks about the law and order way of practicing meditation. You know, it's like, well, we're supposed to be like this, and it's supposed to be like that, and we're supposed to do it well, but that it's really not intended to be like that. The challenge is to bring skillful conditions, so that when we encounter difficulties, we are able to touch those difficulties with a quality that is bright, where we can notice the difficulty, but we have a willingness and a capacity to navigate it in a wholesome way. Like caring for somebody, like, you know, the way we're caring for Brianna, like caring for someone who is injured or sick. You know, that we navigate things, the difficulty, in a wholesome way, and we bring that same quality of care to ourselves. So it's much more than law and order, and much more than a duty, and much more than a thing we're supposed to do right. So it's generated, our practice is generated by a quality of kindness and respect and inner stability. And then the result of that is that one is not tight and tense and rigid, that we're able to be expanded and happy and flexible. The path is always one of bringing skillful conditions to bear. And so then I started thinking about thinking and about how can thought be a skillful condition? How can our practice of thinking be a skillful condition? So in order to talk about thought as skillful, I thought it might be useful to just take a brief moment and speak to the ways that thought is unskillful and really not a wholesome way of practicing. And most of us know about the ways that thought is unskillful, where we criticize. We can criticize ourselves, we can criticize others. There can be an inner tyrant who cultivates not a wholesome, skillful condition, but feeling bad. Thinking about all the ways that we could be better, the law and order, inner tyrant, who notices all the ways we could be better. We're not quite getting it. We're not likely to. We're not as good as somebody else. And a critical mind that focuses too much on what is harmful, or what one might have done wrong. And focuses and lingers and rehearses that elaborates on suffering rather than the cessation of suffering. So it's important to notice that there's such a thing as discernment. To discern when something isn't working quite well. It's not really leading to liberation. It's useful. What is not useful is to turn discernment into criticism, and in particular into self-criticism. We can notice that we had an oops, but we don't have to dwell there. And we could notice that dwelling there actually just leads us to being kind of tight and cramped. So criticism, it would be like a drive that doesn't nourish. Setting up a lot of goals. The thinking mind can set up a lot of goals that we're unlikely to achieve. Setting up a lot of shoulds. Setting up a lot of compulsions. Things must be a certain way, or I must be a certain way. Using words like never, or always, or recriminations. As I was thinking about this, I was thinking about a time some years ago when I used to have, those plastic ice cube trays, before I had this wonderful ice maker, those plastic ice cube trays. And I, in the process of getting the ice cubes out, I twisted it and turned it, and I broke it. And my very, very helpful mind, I watched my very, very helpful mind register the opinion, and I quote, "You always ruin everything." A way of thinking that really doesn't help. So the only thing to do with something, a thought like that, is to notice it and maybe smile. Wonder where that came from. Because it's actually, first of all, not exactly true that I always ruin everything. And furthermore, even if my brother is having a little uncertainty about that, but anyway, even if I did ruin something, it's like an ice cube tray. It's probably not the end of the world on the ice cube tray. But we could notice that our minds have opinions like that. And so that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about contemplation. We're talking about the difference between discernment, noticing what is wholesome, noticing that being human involves making mistakes. Some things work, some things don't. We mess things up. I break ice cube trays. It's just like that. And so noticing, we can discern that this ice cube tray is no longer really workable in the same way because I did indeed break it. It is not, however, either helpful or useful or even true that I always ruin everything. So not a thought to dwell in. So I wanted to take just a minute before I talk about contemplation specifically, because it's so ubiquitous. I was actually just talking to someone today who really struggles, as many of us do, with self-criticism and with a difficulty going forward in practice because standards are so high that, or that we've made mistakes in the past and we get kind of stuck on them. So it's really an important distinction to make when we think about thinking. Because otherwise we can spend our contemplation time contemplating things that are not so wholesome. And digging ourselves bigger and deeper holes. So, contemplation. Here's a quote that I found. Contemplation entails bringing up a concept and dwelling on it steadily and repeatedly until it touches the heart. Then a felt sense is established that can steady, rein in, and gladden the heart. This process goes deeper than merely thinking. People can think about anything without necessarily reflecting on how the heart has been affected. And we can forget to think deeply about what would serve us best. So you can imagine that if I think deeply and contemplate deeply how I always ruin everything, that might not make for a particularly wholesome evening. So contemplation is repeatedly bringing something to mind, gaining its meaning, and letting it settle, not just in the mind, but also in the heart and the body. Like breathing deeply, some goodness in. And because we're so used to, in the West especially, we're so used to two things. We're so used to concepts. We're so used to trying to imagine that thinking is going to solve all our problems. Well, if I have a problem, I just think about it. I just figure it out. Maybe, but maybe not. And then we're so used to using thinking as a tool of criticism that the idea of contemplating what is wholesome and bringing it into our heart and into our bodies can be a bit of a foreign concept. Really? I'm really even allowed to do that? You're not really allowed to do it. That is our practice. Anybody, I want to just pause there for a second. Anybody want to comment on any of that before I go on? Anybody have a? Yeah, John.
So, does contemplation imply, is proper contemplation something that has a positive feeling or tone in the heart?
In the Buddhist teaching, yes. And now, obviously, I can contemplate all kinds of things that don't. But if our path is one of bringing skillful conditions to bear, our path is not only one of bringing skillful conditions, Ajahn Suchita says our path is always one of bringing skillful conditions. Then if you want it to be a skillful condition, then yes.
Okay.
You look puzzled still, no?
No. So that's a good can be a good indicator for whether
Yes.
we're doing something skillful, we're contemplating skillfully.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I'll go back to Ajahn Suchita's quote, which really lands with me so beautifully. He says, the path is always one of bringing skillful conditions to bear, noting, making much of, expanding, dwelling in skillful conditions, and letting them have their effect to dislodge unskillful habitual conditions. So dwelling in skillful conditions and just letting them have their effect. It's sort of like, lots of times people talk about the loving kindness practice. And I was just reading, who was I reading? Wendy Palmer, who was saying that when she did the practice, it was 3 months before she actually could feel kindness. And she just kept doing it, kept doing it, kept doing it. And then it finally kind of seeped in a way that really landed more deeply in her body. Thank you. Good question. Others? Anybody else? Barbara, you have there's a hand, but I think it might be a mistake. No? I think it's a mistake because I think it's been there a while. So no problem. Anybody else who has anything you want to add or question or wonder about? Or okay. I don't see anybody else. So what does the Buddha have to say about contemplation? You've heard me teach on this many times because it's my favorite sutta. And I come to the Mahanama Sutta. And Mahanama was somebody who, during the Rains retreat, the 3-month retreats, would come and he would listen to the Buddha teach. And as the retreat was coming to the end and he knew the Buddha was leaving, he came up to the Buddha and he said, I feel kind of bad that you're leaving here. You've been doing all this great teaching for us. But so after you're gone, give us some guidance, if you will. What should we think about? Basically, how do we teach ourselves after you're gone? And the Buddha says, excellent, Mahanama, excellent, great question. It is fitting for clansmen like you to ask, what should you think about? And so he goes on to teach, what should one think about? And he says there are certain qualities that you cultivate initially, and these are qualities the Buddha says that you already have cultivated, because if you hadn't, you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be practicing, you wouldn't be listening to this. So, one who is aroused to practice, he said, is one of conviction, that you have an intention, you want your life to be wholesome. Is one of persistence, so you keep at it. Okay. Is one of someone who has some established mindfulness. Okay. Mindfulness, a capacity to be aware of one's body, one's breath, what's going on. It has some ability to concentrate, and is discerning, and discern what's useful and what's not useful. Again, he didn't say he's criticizing themselves, but is discerning. So he says those are sort of prerequisites. And the Buddha proposes to Mahanama that he actually has those qualities or he wouldn't be there. And I would actually propose to each of you, you have those qualities or you wouldn't be here. Now you might be thinking, yeah, but I'm not really, I don't have enough persistence, this is not, and I would propose the law and order approach to meditation, that you only focus on what you do not do exactly perfectly. You're not enlightened yet. Fair enough. We can discern that none of us is enlightened yet. Good enough. But it is not useful to criticize ourselves if we are somewhat, less than perfect in one of these dimensions. We could notice that in terms of what the Buddha is speaking to, in terms of our intention, of our persistence, our mindfulness, our concentration, our discernment, good enough to practice. And then the question is bringing skillful conditions. So here's a skillful condition of contemplation. And then the Buddha says, let's see if I think I said all that. The Buddha says, he says there are 6 things you could contemplate. Given that you have an initial practice, there are 6 things you could concentrate. I'll run through them and then I'm going to come back and go through them more slowly. 1 is you could contemplate the Buddha. 2 is you could contemplate the Dharma, the teachings. 3 is you could contemplate the Sangha, the community of people who practice. 4, we did a lot of work on this one at the retreat. You could contemplate your virtues. What? The Buddha said part of our spiritual practice is to contemplate our virtues? Yes. 5 is you could contemplate your own generosity. I find it really interesting that he says, first of all, number 4 is to contemplate virtues, and then he makes a special case of 5 is contemplating your generosity, your own generosity. And 6 is to contemplate the devas. The devas are basically unseen beings who are guides, are helpers. Sort of like I was raised Catholic, and in the Catholic Church, we pray to the saints, sort of like, that sort of thing. And I expanded my understanding of devas a little bit. We'll get to it a little bit. Okay, so the Buddha says, contemplate these things. These are, in terms of your thinking mind, these are things that could be useful. He says, with respect to, wait a minute, I lost a page. With respect to the Buddha and contemplating the Buddha, he says, at any time when a disciple is recollecting the Buddha, his mind is not overcome with passion, not overcome with aversion, not overcome with delusion. His mind heads straight. And when the mind is headed straight, the disciple of the noble ones gains a sense of the goal, gains a sense of the Dhamma, gains joy connected with the Dhamma. And in one who is joyful, the body grows calm. One whose body is calmed experiences ease. In one at ease, the mind becomes concentrated. And one of the other teachings, one of the other suttas says, you don't have to make these things happen. They just do. It's like you turn on the faucet and the water runs down. You don't have to make the water run in any particular way. You just practice skillfully and these things happen, gaining a sense of the goal, gaining a sense of the Dhamma. He says, Mahanama, you should develop this recollection of the Buddha while you are walking, while you are standing, while you are sitting, while you are lying down, while you are busy at work, and here's my favorite, while you are resting in your home crowded with children. You should cultivate this recollection of the Buddha. Well, but what does that mean? Contemplate the Buddha. And again, our critical mind could say, okay, Buddha, 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 Buddha. Okay, somebody lived like a really long time ago in a situation that really wasn't anything like ours, who was really way, way more advanced, so far more advanced than I am, and therefore is irrelevant to my actual life. That's not what he means by contemplating. What he means is something more along the lines of when the Buddha, the story of when the Buddha decided, when Siddhartha, who had become enlightened, he decided to teach. And he taught because he cared about people. He said, it might be wearisome for me, but there are people who have little dust in their eyes. And I want to share this goodness with them. So what if the contemplation of the Buddha was like the most benevolent parent that you could imagine? Maybe not even your very own parent, but the most benevolent parent that you could imagine, who wanted only goodness for you. And who was wise and accomplished, and somebody who would give you guidance and care about you no matter what, no matter how many mistakes you made, who completely understood and accepted you exactly as you are, and who wanted to help you be free from suffering. What if that's what he means by contemplating the Buddha? Another way of contemplating the Buddha is to contemplate the Buddha within. Again, a critical mind would say, I ain't got no Buddha within, don't be ridiculous. But actually, we could notice that when you hear certain teachings, I used the word earlier, that the mind becomes bright. Or, if only my bell would work on this thing, or you hear certain teachings and it's like a bell rings. You go, right. I recognize the goodness of that. That's the Buddha within recognizing liberation. You could notice when that happens for you. When you read something in the newspaper and you delight in someone's goodness, that is your being, that is your Buddha delighting in goodness. So contemplating the Buddha could mean you read something or you hear a story like that, and you just think about it during the day and you let it touch your heart. You let it nourish you. No particular goal, no particular agenda. It's just nourishment. It's just food. He tells Mahanama to contemplate the Dharma with exactly the same language. He says, when you're contemplating the Dharma, your mind is not overcome with passion or aversion or delusion. One whose body is calmed experiences ease. In one at ease, the mind becomes concentrated. He says you should develop this recollection, Mahanama, while you are walking, while you are standing, while you are sitting, while you are lying down, while you are busy at work, while you are resting in your home crowded with children. Sometimes when we, the critical mind in terms of contemplating the Dharma would say something like, the Dharma, I don't really know much of anything about that. There are all these lists, there's all these teachings. Half of them I don't understand. Some of them I don't even believe. Whatever. I'm just not really up to speed on the Dharma. That's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is contemplating the Dharma. Well, one example I think of, I'm standing in line at the grocery store, and there's somebody up in front who's having an argument with the cashier. All kinds of ways to contemplate the Dharma in that moment. Patience, kindness. May you have ease. I've used the example of I used to live on a busy country road, and coming upon a whole row of bicyclists. Contemplate the Dharma. May you be safe and free from danger. Wishing those bicyclists well, or what a nice opportunity to just pause and breathe. So it can be really simple kinds of things, contemplating the Dharma. When there's a teaching that resonates, I think about Jean and Tim's teaching last week on happiness. To really take it into your heart, into your body, take it home with you, contemplate. The thing Tim did about laughing. Well, that was kind of weird, but my body feels kind of good when I think about that. Contemplating the Dharma. Bringing skillful conditions to bear, letting them have their effect. The third one is contemplating the Sangha. We can in our critical mind say this Sangha is like, I don't really even know what the Sangha is. And besides, it's this bunch of people, they've been together for like a really long time. They all like each other a whole lot. They're way more advanced than I am. And furthermore, I'm an outsider and new to this, and they probably don't even want new people here. And so I'm not very important anyway. That's not what the Buddha is talking about when he's talking about contemplating the Sangha. He's talking about contemplating people who, over the centuries, have practiced these teachings and have nourished them and given them to us. And he's talking about, I think about just, whatever beings, whatever people, whatever teachers, whatever mentors, whatever friends. When I'm distressed and I can call a friend and ask for support and guidance. And, oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm not alone here. I can contemplate the Sangha. I can contemplate the community of people who practice some of these teachings and who help one another. And just even looking around, look at all of us who are, inquiring into this together. There's lots of things we could be doing on a Tuesday evening. Here we are, and what is the poet? He says, none of us has gone far. This is of course true. And at the same time, we all help each other. Can we contemplate the Sangha? We spent a fair amount of time at the retreat contemplating our virtues. That could be a really challenging one. But it's very specific. He says, furthermore, there is the case where you recollect your own virtues. They are untorn, unbroken, unspotted, unsplattered, liberating, praised by the wise, untarnished, conducive to concentration. And he goes on with the same thing. Anytime when a disciple is recollecting virtue, his mind is not overcome with passion or aversion. His mind heads straight based on virtue. And when the mind is headed straight, the disciple of the noble ones gains a sense of the goal, gains a sense of the Dhamma, gains joy, and grows calm. So contemplating our virtues, one of the contemplations we did on the retreat was, talk to another person about your virtues. That was kind of a hard one for a lot of us. Seriously, you want me to say to somebody else what my virtue is? And I'm going to fold this into the next one, into generosity, which has its own little category, the virtue of generosity. And everybody has some virtue. Everybody has some generosity, including the receiving of generosity. There was this lovely man who held the door for me when I went into Wegmans today. The generosity of receiving. And maybe the virtue that you have today is that you petted your dog. Or that you picked your socks up off the floor when you didn't really feel like it. To really be willing to notice, discern, and contemplate your virtues. And the last one is contemplating devas. I'm not going to go into that for two reasons. One is I don't understand the devas all that much anyway. But the other is that we don't have time, and good for me that I don't have to go into it, something I don't understand very much. But one thing I do understand is one of the ways that I consider contemplating the helpers is what Mr. Rogers says, when you're in difficulty, look for the helpers and contemplate the seen and the unseen helpers. and bring those into your awareness so that they might nourish you.